Good morning. Today we're going to talk about Israel 2013. What is Israel like today, and how has it come to that point? You can see from this slide that there have been a number of forces that have shaped Israel in recent years. First and foremost, I would list the 1967 war. Second, the end of the Cold War and the great Russian immigration. Third, the changing Middle East. And fourth, globalization. I'm going to talk about all of these and how they made Israel what it is today, and end with the strengths and challenges that Israel faces as it moves into its future. First, the 1967 war. Remember, the 1967 war was a radical change for Israel. That's what Israelis call the Six-Day War. It was a rapid victory. It led to a kind of euphoric sense of victory. Not only that, it led in Israel, as we mentioned, it led in Israel to a belief almost in a spiritual quality to that war. And certainly it emboldened religious forces that felt that there was the hand of God, a kind of messianic force that was leading to this victory, leading Israel to reclaim its historic biblical territories. And you can see from the maps here, the map on the left is the period before the 1967 war. Israel is marked by this very, very narrow neck between Haifa and Tel Aviv. And then you see the results of the war, the occupation of Egypt's Sinai Desert, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. So there was this feeling in Israel that they had now done away with the problem of that narrow neck, of the possibility of dividing Israel at that neck by an invading army. There was a tremendous sense of confidence and euphoria that came out after that war. But as time has gone on, that war has become more and more of an albatross around the neck of Israel. First of all, there is a tremendous expense associated with occupation. The Israelis need forces in the West Bank. They needed forces in the Sinai Desert. They needed forces in the Gaza Strip, both to govern the population there and to protect against an attack by the neighboring countries who were intent upon regaining their territory. There was a growing concern with security as a result of this 67 war. At first, the population was in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip particularly, that population was traumatized and was quiescent. But as time went on, that population felt it was living under a foreign occupation. It was not friendly to the Israeli rulers, and they began to engage in more and more acts of sabotage, and finally, what we have talked about already, the two intifadas, or revolts against Israel, leading to tremendous expenses to contain these, and also the preoccupation that occurred in Israel with suicide bombers, with all kinds of sabotage, and with all the difficulties that emanated from ruling these territories. And there was a detrimental effect on the relations between Israelis and Palestinians of all stripes. As a result of the 1967 war, the Palestinians outside Israel began to organize into a liberation movement to liberate the occupied territories. That was the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, organized by one primary group called Fatah and led by Yasser Arafat. But the 1967 war also had an effect on Arabs, Palestinians inside of Israel. The citizens of Israel make up almost 20% of the population. And they too began to feel an alienation from Israeli society. They began to identify more as Palestinians with their cousins and brothers in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip. And so you had this kind of growing or insidious effect of the 1967 war, poisoning the relations between Palestinians and Israelis. Here you see in this slide pictures of the separation barrier. On the left is a close-up, and you can see how on the right the separation wall actually differentiates between Israeli settlements. Those are the near ones, I believe. It's hard to see now. Those are the far ones, and the Palestinian ones. So what you had was a growing feeling that Palestinians and Israelis could never live together, and that they had to be separated by this wall, and that this began to privilege Israelis in particular ways. So here you have, running through the occupied territory, what's called a bypass road. Tremendous amounts of money were spent on bypass roads. These were roads that were only open to Jews. And Palestinians from the local territories were not allowed to use those roads. They used those, you can see the parallel unpaved road. And so it led to a kind of hierarchy in Israeli society in the places that Israel ruled. Here's another picture. This is a picture, two pictures again, of the checkpoints, which became a kind of national humiliation for Palestinians. And if you talk to any Palestinian from the West Bank today, they will first and foremost bring up the checkpoints and how difficult they are. They make movement very difficult from place to place in the West Bank, strangling the economy of the West Bank, make it difficult for Palestinians and Israelis to move back and forth between the West Bank and Israel. And as you can see on the right, they lead to a sense of national humiliation, bitterness, and hatred that has been growing and growing since the 1967 war. And here you have also the introduction of a whole new group in Israeli society. These are called the settlers. These are people who set up towns and villages and cities in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Sinai, and Golan Heights after 1967. Many of them were religiously motivated by that feeling that, in fact, what had happened was a God, an act of God, and therefore they should follow and do God's will. But you can also see the sense of humiliation that it has created for the Palestinians in these territories. On the left, you see a horrible scene. On the right, you see a triumphal scene. That is the bringing in of a unit that will establish a new settlement in the West Bank, and the cheering of the people who see themselves as the vanguard of Israeli society, but who have a lot of opposition and a lot of enemies inside the old borders of Israel. And finally, the 1967 war has had another impact that has been very serious, and that is it has had a corrosive effect on Israeli democracy and on political life in Israel. There are two sets of laws in the West Bank, one for Jews and one for Arabs. There is a privilege that Israeli settlers have in courts over Palestinians. And so the kind of sense of justice, equality, that existed now is a system where you have two sets of laws for different people, and that sense of a single system of justice has begun to wither away. Beyond that, the effect on young Israeli soldiers in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip before, or any of the other territories, who really had to keep order, who had to, as one political leader put it, break the knees of young 12 and 13-year-old children throwing stones against the occupation. This too has a corrosive effect. It leads to a brutalization of Israeli society and a difficulty in dealing with problems through normal institutional channels, courts, bureaucracies, and the like. Violence instead became the order of the day. The final element I want to mention on the effect of the '67 war is that it postponed the day when Israel will know what its borders are. Now, between 1948 and the war in 1967, there was a sense, even though these were not official borders, they were called armistice lines or ceasefire lines, there was a sense that the borders that Israel had were going to be its permanent borders. That all evaporated after 1967. But what will be the borders? No one quite knows. For a short time, I think countries can live with this quite comfortably, not knowing what their borders will be. But now we are talking about a period of more than 45 years since the 1967 war, where this question of borders is open, and it's really unclear how far Israeli institutions should reach, how they should be built. All sorts of questions about the future are postponed because Israel doesn't really know what territory it's going to have. The second element that I wanted to talk about affecting Israel in 2013 beyond the 1967 war was the end of the Cold War, the confrontation that went on for almost for about 45 years between the Soviet Union and the United States, the nuclear confrontation that affected so much. That end of the Cold War had a massive effect on Israel and its neighbors, both in terms of its domestic life and in terms of Israel's international position. Here we have a map of the Middle East, a pretty standard map. One of the first things that happened was, when the Soviet Union dissolved, was that countries that had been enemies with Israel, and in fact still are enemies with Israel, no longer had the backing of the Soviet Union. And that backing had been important to them in their confrontation with Israel. Particularly important was Syria, but also Iraq. Both of them had been supported by the Soviet Union, and now there was no Soviet Union to support them. Also the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, had been supported by the Soviet Union and no longer had that backing. This strengthened Israel's hand, at least ostensibly. And the first reaction in Israel was, oh, this is great, the Cold War is over, and our side, the United States' side, won, and therefore we are winners too. On a little more reflection, Israeli leaders began to worry that they too were losers in the end of the Cold War. The United States' support, they knew, during the Cold War was in part due to the fact that Israel could be a surrogate for the United States in the Middle East and stand up to the Soviet-led states, could stand up to Syria, could stand up to Iraq, could stand up to the PLO. But in fact, if there is no Cold War, the United States wasn't interested in Syria or Iraq or the PLO in terms of their connection to the Soviet Union. And Israeli leaders began to worry, if that's true, why would the United States continue to support us in the way that they did in the past? We can't do for them what we did during the Cold War. This led to some serious rethinking in Israel about its what's called strategic options. That is, how how things should play out in the Middle East. Should it continue to have the same kind of policies that it had in the past, or should it move towards new policies? And in fact, this consideration that its position might be weakened by the fact that the United States will no longer unequivocally stand behind it led Israel to begin talks with some of the Arab states that it had never had relations with, and in fact led to talks with the PLO, which had long labeled as a terrorist organization, had actually had a law banning any government or non-government official to talking to anybody in the PLO. You could get arrested for simply talking to PLO representatives. Now Israel engaged in secret negotiations 4 years after the Cold War ended with the PLO, leading to the Oslo Accords. We'll come back to those. The end of the Cold War had another effect. This was more domestic rather than its international relations in the Middle East or its strategic position. And that was the end of the Cold War led to this tremendous Russian immigration. 1 million people were added to the population in the 1990s. 1 million people. It's about 15 to 20% of the entire Israeli population. These huge numbers were added to the Israeli society. These included, as I mentioned in the last lecture, very high numbers of engineers and scientists. Probably 15 or so percent of all workers coming were high-tech workers. That was a very, very high percentage. But also it added musicians, it added dancers, it added new culture to society. The best theater group within a couple of years of this massive immigration was a new Russian theater group. So it added a whole new dimension, economic and cultural, to Israeli society, really transforming the society in substantial ways. Those million workers really added new verve to the economy after the period of stagnation that had existed beforehand. And with their labor and their education, new kinds of businesses grew. We'll talk more about this in a little while. The Russian immigration also created some dilemmas, because the question of whether these people coming in were actually Jews was a very important one in the Jewish state. Now, by some definitions, they were Jews. Their grandfathers might have been Jewish, or their grandmothers might have been Jewish. But in fact, by Jewish law, many of these people were not Jewish. They were coming out of mixed marriages in which the mother was not Jewish, and therefore, by Jewish law, these people too were not Jewish. And it raised all kinds of questions. As many as 30 to 50% of them may not have been Jewish, and this raised big questions for what does it mean to be in a Jewish state? Should these people be considered non-Jews like the Arabs, or should they be considered Jews but they're not Jews? No one knew the answers to these questions. It raised tremendous public policy questions in Israel. Also, the Russians came into Israel and they had a particular kind of politics. They didn't just blend into all the political parties that existed, at least that first generation. And surprisingly, having come from a communist country, maybe it's not so surprising, they were deeply anti-leftist. They tended to be right-wing. They had had enough of communism and socialism and all the kinds of government intervention in their lives. They tended to vote for the more right-wing parties and then therefore help tip an enduring balance to the right for the next 15 years or so, and which continues today with the Netanyahu government. They also tended to be very hawkish on the question of peace with the Palestinians. And just at a time when Israel was beginning to consider signing some kind of permanent peace agreement with the Palestinians, you introduced into the society a quite hawkish group. So the Russians had a big effect on all aspects, cultural, social, political, and economic of Israeli society. Here are two very important figures among the Russian immigrants. The one on the left is Anatoly Sharansky, or also called Natan Sharansky, who was what was called a refusnik. That is, in Russia, in the Soviet Union, I should say, he was jailed time and again, sent to Siberia, into the Gulag for fighting for Jewish rights, fighting for the right for Jews to emigrate from the Soviet Union to Israel. And there was a very interesting moment. He actually was able to become part of a prisoner exchange during the Cold War, before the Cold War ended, and come to Israel, where he became a well-known politician and leader of the Russian community. And there's a very interesting story that a couple of stories on his going. When he was being exchanged, there was a bridge that he had to walk across, and the Russians said to him, "Listen, you just walk straight across that bridge, no games." And Sharansky, in his typical way, walked zigzag across the bridge to show that even in the last moment, he was not going to accept his orders from the Soviet officials. When he got to Israel, there was tremendous celebration, songs and dancing. And I happened to be in Israel at one point where he was interviewed on TV, and it was a kind of talking heads element, and the interviewer said, "So we have with us Anatoly Sharansky," and he turned to Sharansky and he said, "You know, your name is Anatoly in Russian, but I know you were given the Hebrew name, the Israeli name of Natan. Do you have a preference?" And Sharansky said, "Yeah, you know, my friends in the Soviet Union wanted to give me that name, and I took the name of Natan. Yeah, I guess I prefer that name," he said. An hour of talking went by on the interview, and at the end of the interview, the camera kind of swings over to the interviewer. You don't see Sharansky anymore, and the interviewer says, "I'd like to thank Anatoly Sharansky for being on this program," and you see a hand come into the screen and grab the interviewer by the shoulder, and you hear the voice say, "I told you, I prefer Natan." So these were tough people. Jews who lived in the Soviet Union, who were leaders, became tough and their toughness was reflected as they entered Israeli politics. The second figure is Avigdor Lieberman, who became a kind of strongman in politics, started his own party, and unlike Sharansky, was able to attract into his party people who were not Russian immigrants, a broader-based party. He was the recent foreign minister of Israel, but had to resign because he is on trial for corruption. So we've talked about two impacts that world events had: the 1967 war, the end of the Cold War on what Israel is today. A third effect is the changing region. And this is a very important element. When Israel was created in 1948, the new ideology, movement that excited people in the countries around Israel was Arab nationalism. And the idea that there would be a unification of the Arabs into a single state, that Egypt and Syria and Iraq and Jordan would all become one country, and that Israel, in a sense, was an impediment to that, and it also was sitting in the middle of what should be the Arab country. And so there was a real hatred of Israel, not only because of the conflict with the Palestinians, but because of the sense that Israel was blocking the unification of the Arab world. That Arab nationalism began to wane after the 1967 war and the failure of the Arab countries in the war with Israel. And it lost its power, it's lost its oomph, it lost its attractiveness. And this was reflected in the new president of Egypt after the 1967 war, Anwar Sadat, who became the president of Egypt in 1970. And he said, you know what? Let's forget about this Arab unification. Let's forget about creating one state. And let's not get fixated on Israel. We have huge domestic internal problems. Let's solve our problems with Israel and let's move forward. And in fact, he visited Israel, spoke to the Knesset, and this was followed by a very famous scene here, President Jimmy Carter hosting Sadat, who's on the left, and the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin on the right, and signing an accord which led to a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt. Egypt was the most important enemy that Israel had had. It was the biggest, most powerful country. This was the most important foreign policy achievement of Israel in its history. It was able to achieve a peaceful southern border with Egypt for years and years and years to come. It wasn't the peace that Israel had hoped for. People complained that it was a cold peace and not a warm peace. It didn't matter. It really gave Israel a chance to breathe. And it enabled Israel, when it had the economic stabilization program, to decrease its defense expenditures because it didn't really have to defend that border anymore with the peace treaty. Another important result of the waning of Arab nationalism was that the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, now began to take responsibility itself for the Palestinian problem, and it came to the conclusion that it wasn't going to destroy Israel, it wasn't going to displace it, and that it could come to some kind of peace agreement with Israel in which the West Bank and the Gaza Strip would become the basis of a Palestinian state. This is called the two-state solution, and this also was very important, and it was signified by this moment. Here, President Bill Clinton is in the middle. On the right, looking quite happy, is Yasser Arafat, signing what was called the Oslo Accords, an agreement to achieve a peace treaty within 7 years. And on the left is the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin, who looks less happy, but determined to move ahead. That peace treaty, as you well know, never took place. But the Oslo Accords are still considered by both the binding agreement between them. And if there ever were a peace treaty, this probably would be the basis for the peace treaty. Finally, the death of Arab nationalism led to a new kind of ideology in the Middle East, in the surrounding Israel, and that was Islamic militancy, political Islam, where there was an argument that the Islam could be the basis of modern political rule. Now, this was first captured by the Iranians, who established the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979 in their famous revolution that overthrew the Shah. They then provided a model. Yes, you can have a republic, a modern government, that has a strong Islamic political component. The difficulty for Israel was that this was a renewed basis for hatred of Israel. The political Islamists became, like the early Arab nationalists, diehards arguing for the destruction of Israel. Here you see a picture of that reflects this movement from Arab nationalism. On the left is the president of Egypt from 1952 until 1970, Gamal Abdel Nasser, and on the right, a figure that represents political Islam in the head of Hezbollah, the Sheikh Hassan Nasrallah. On a more contemporary basis, the change in the region is reflected in the Arab Spring. It began in December of 2010 and carried into 2011 and beyond. Now, the Arab Spring was interesting from a number of points of view for Israel, some positive and some negative. Israel viewed the Arab Spring with great trepidation. It feared that the leaders it had worked with, particularly the then president of Egypt, Hosni Mubarak, who Israel had had close relations with in terms of security and working on a number of issues together, that if that person was gone, what would happen to Israel's relationship with Egypt? And it worried about the other countries as well. It had now a peace treaty with Jordan since 1994. Would that be wiped out? Would there be chaos around Israel? Israel was very worried. It had begun to insinuate itself into the daily life of the Middle East. Even though it didn't have official ties with Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and some of the other Arab states, it had unofficial ties with them. So Israel was feeling more and more comfortable in the Middle East, and now all of a sudden, this cataclysmic change came to the region, and Israelis did not know what effect it would have. Now, what was the change all about here? I'm going to give you two pictures, which are kind of striking. This is a picture of Tahrir Square in Cairo, which you've read and heard much about. It's the center of this vibrant city of Cairo, and here it is in a picture before the Arab Spring, with the hotels in the background. It's a green area. Traffic is crazy, as you can see. And here is the same picture with the same perspective during the Arab Spring. Tahrir Square filled with 1 million people. Now, the first element that was very interesting in the relationship to Israel of this is that in years past, uprisings, riots, strikes, other things of this sort often had been directed at foreigners, directed particularly at Israel and the United States, that they were the source of all of Egypt's or Tunisia's or Bahrain's problems. In the Arab Spring, this didn't happen at all. Israel and the United States were barely acknowledged by these crowds in Tahrir Square. There were a few signs scattered here and there, but not much at all. What in fact happened was that Egyptians began to focus inward on their own corrupt government, on the difficulties they had, their stagnant economies, and all the rest that was wrong with life in Egypt and Tunisia and the other countries that suffered from long periods of dictatorship and autocracy. So from Israel's point of view, that was good. Israel was not the scapegoat. It was not the whipping boy. It was sitting off and watching what was going on. That was very good. What was less positive from Israel's point of view is that in the wake of the Arab Spring, Hosni Mubarak, the ally of Israel, fell, and a period of uncertainty followed. Then an election came which elected the representative of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, this is President Morsi, the current president of Egypt. The Muslim Brotherhood had long been antithetical to Israel. It really had no kind word for Israel at all. And in fact, many members of the Muslim Brotherhood engaged in crass anti-Semitic as well as anti-Israeli remarks. Israel began to wonder now if, in fact, the representative of the Muslim Brotherhood was elected as president, and the Muslim Brotherhood was the biggest party now in the parliament, what was going to happen to relations? And that question is still on the table. The first indications were actually kind of positive for Israel, in that the Morsi sent, as soon as he was elected, sent a letter to the president of Israel, Shimon Peres, in which he said, look, the peace treaty is going to stay, and I hope we can have real relations. Israel was not even sure that this letter was real. It published it, and in fact, the Egyptians verified and validated the letter, so it was real. But it's clear that Israel can no longer have the relations with Egypt that it had in the past, and the peace treaty remains in place, but Israel remains very, very tense about what that means. Beyond Egypt, if we go back to this map of the Middle East, Israel is now much more isolated than it had been in the 1990s and 2000s. Remember I said how it had begun to insinuate itself into the Middle East. It had good relations with Turkey. It had good relations with Egypt. It had a kind of modus vivendi with Syria, where while there was no peace, there also was no active fighting. The difficulties Israel had in the region were local differences. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and Iran was the biggest threat that Israel faced. But in facing Iran, it also was able to come closer to other countries fearing Iran. Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Jordan, Egypt, all feared Iran, and therefore quietly allied with Israel against Iran. Once the Arab Spring took place, Israel's position was much more tenuous. Turkey, which had been a close friend, drifted from Israel. Egypt, I've already talked about, a cold distance between Israel and the Egyptians. And Israel now much more isolated in the Middle East than it had been for the last 20 years or so. Now I want to talk about the fourth factor that affected Israel in recent years, and that's globalization, or the creation of a new Israeli economy. And we talked about this to some degree last time. Israel now became a high-tech society. It's become vibrant, it's become robust, it has not only a high rate of economic growth and some of the most advanced industries in the world, but beyond economics, it has a functioning democracy, probably the best functioning democracy in the Middle East, and one that does very well, as seen by the last elections, in really reflecting the will of the public. It has high citizen participation in politics. It has numerous NGOs, non-governmental organizations, non-profits, which create a civil society dealing with all sorts of issues in Israeli society. And all that is in addition to being one of the leading and fastest growing economies in the world. And yet, it faces challenges, international and domestic, to its position in the Middle East and its domestic position. What are the challenges that Israel faces in the next few years, and what are the opportunities it has? Let's look at the challenges. First of all, international challenges are huge. They always have been for Israel, and that hasn't changed very much. First of all, there is the Palestinian issue, the nagging issue. It started back in 1920 when two peoples were claiming the same piece of land, the Jews and the Palestinians, the Palestinian Arabs, and that has not been resolved. We talked about the 1993 Oslo Accords, which seemed to be a step in the right direction, but if we look over the last 10 years, there have not been serious negotiations. We are therefore in a position where we are no closer now than we were 20 years ago to a Palestinian-Israeli peace. Second, Hezbollah in the north remains a difficult and violent foe for Israel. Engaged in subversion around the world, probably in Argentina against Jews there, killing of citizens in Bulgaria, and also several wars, including the 2006 war between Lebanon and Israel. In Syria, Israel faces chaos. It had always depended on Syria as a kind of stable foe, where at least since 1973, there had been no overt war. So we're talking about 40 years of quiet on that border. And now Syria is falling apart, and there's tremendous concern inside Israel, and concern that, in fact, weapons, including chemical weapons, may be moved from Syria to Hezbollah. And there has been a bombing by Israel, although it hasn't admitted to it, in Syria, which was probably to interdict those kinds of weapons from getting to Hezbollah. I already mentioned also the isolation in the region. This is another serious challenge. And finally, I want to mention a movement to delegitimize Israel, to say that it is no longer a legitimate state. And we can see this in a number of different ways that this comes forth. One element that you see here is what's called the BDS movement, the Boycott, Divest, and Sanction movement, some of whose members are dedicated to ending Israel's occupation. Some have more sinister goals. So those are the international challenges that Israel faces, and they are quite formidable. Israel, at the same time, faces domestic challenges. And those domestic challenges are probably going to be the litmus test of what Israel becomes in the future. Is Israeli society, like we said, unified, a civil society, high participation in which people act together despite their differences, or is it a fragmented society? Well, there are a number of fault lines that we should look at. Number one is Arab and Jewish Israelis. This is the most obvious fault line. It's a fault line between the Jews, who make up 80% or so of the population, that's counting the Russians as Jews, and the Arabs, who make up about 20% of the population. The rift, as I said, between them has grown in recent years. It's become more difficult as the Palestinian problem has lingered and not been solved. And although people like to look at at the picture on the right of an Israeli and Arab child arm in arm with one another, it's less and less the case. And more you see hostility, division, and isolation of the two groups. The second fault line is a religious fault line. And there are at least 3 different points on a continuum, and it really is a continuum from totally secular to ultra-Orthodox. The points on the continuum include the secular Israelis, who are probably the majority of society, and have been rather quiescent on religious questions until recently. The second biggest party to be elected, the party of Yair Lapid in the recent elections, ran on a platform that was designed to attract secular Israelis against the privileges of the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox. The second point on the continuum is Orthodox Jews, and many of these are modern Orthodox Jews. They look like anybody else in society. They dress pretty similarly, but they too have their divisions with the secular and with the third point, the group on the third point of the continuum, the Haredi Jews, or the ultra-Orthodox Jews. A third fault line is between rich and poor. As I said in the earlier lecture, inequality is very, very high in Israel. And here you see pictures of protests, the tent cities on the right and a sign on the left, indicating this dissatisfaction with how a few are privileged and many are suffering. And finally, the last difference is what I would call a cultural difference. Here you have pictures of Tel Aviv. On the left, the city with the sea. It's one of the great kind of night spots in the world. On the right, you see cafe life in Tel Aviv. And this slide shows Jerusalem. Very different cultural life. Much more reflective of the divisions in society. Arabs, Jews, religious, non-religious. And a much more traditional life. And so there are really different cultures vying for dominance in Israel. So we see all these divisions in the midst of a society that's growing rapidly, that is high-tech. It has the second biggest exporter of software in the world, the large number of workers who are scientists and technicians, this tremendous vibrancy in the society and in the economy, together with all this fragmentation. So the challenges are many, but the resources are many too. The human resources in Israel and the material resources to face those challenges. Only time will tell how Israelis will deal with the challenges they face, whether they will face them as a fairly unified society or as warring tribes.